Hello there, ladies and gents, and welcome to the 7th part of the World Builder Wiki video series with me, MonolithicBacon. In this part, we're going to be looking predominantly at the object placement tool. Now, this object placement tool is something that we've used before in these tutorials, but if you're following on the written version of the wiki, we haven't delved too deeply into this. Now, although we've gone over the controls in some depth of how to select objects, place them, rotate them, and so on, what I wanted to focus on mostly in this video is where most of the objects actually are. Now, here we are back on our map 2-player flood, and as you can see, I've had a little bit of fun in between videos. I've started placing more walls, I've put pillars up on this area, and I've started to try and flesh out the map with the object splines we were looking at back in part 6. You should also notice that the fences, the wooden fences that I use spacing on to try and close them together, have also been laid around the map. I've used a different type of wall, a low dry stone wall. And for now, the map is getting there. It just has a few objects in it, but no real standalone objects. So, what we're going to do is have a look at what objects we can place around our map and basically focus on where to find them. This step and this tool in particular can be quite intimidating for first time users of the World Builder. You might not necessarily know where to look. So as before, what we're going to do is make sure when your object placement tool is open, we are going to go into EBPS and environment. Now, art ambient and art nature are where you will find every single object that you should need. There are a few other objects scattered around like visual objects, but that is definitely not for this level of mapping. This is for far more advanced levels when you are trying to do a very specific thing with your map. It's not recommended until you are at a more advanced level or you're more comfortable with the tools. Now, as before, we've gone over the idea that art ambient is mostly man-made objects, whereas art nature is natural objects. When we go into art ambient, we have bridges, buildings, code 2, and objects. And again, you'll find the vast majority in objects. In bridges, you'll find only bridges. In buildings, you'll find the various different types of buildings, but again, only buildings there. And code 2, because they are campaign-specific objects, they aren't really recommended. Some of these will have some scripts tied into them, and if you try to use them in your map, it may cause some issues. So let's not go there yet. But within objects, you have a very, very large selection. And what I'm trying to use here is a nice mix of things that you would probably want to use if you are also doing a rural map. So folders to particularly note will be things like farm features. Within here, you've got various different farm-esque objects like hay bales, outhouses, ploughs, water wheels, tractors. We've also got things like home features, which is only a small folder that has clotheslines to put outside houses. And then we've got things like market. In markets, you've got everything from wagons, like these, so it makes it look like you've got a market stall. And we've also got crates. Crates are fantastic for populating your maps. They look great just about wherever they go. And because most crates or wooden objects like these create yellow cover, they can be dispersed anywhere you want. And they can be crushed very early in the game, but they can also be a lifeline for infantry if they're caught out in the open. So, we can go around the map and place loads of objects like these, but that will take far too long. So let's go back through our list and see what else we could use in this sort of map. If we have a look at statues, for example, there are a few very unique ones that might actually be fitting with our house here. What I've done is built this wall and used pillars, which we'll go on to in a moment when we look at stone pillars and walls. But in fountains, we might be able to find a few that are quite unique. Now, this town statue is probably a little bit too large, but the lions are quite nice. We could probably try and find a space for them near the front. And what we can do is maybe focus on building a driveway here. So if it's a bit of a nice manor house, have a driveway that leads up this way and going past the lions. You'll also find some very nice things in yards and parks if you're building quite a rural map. You've got wooden benches and stone benches, and these provide yellow and green cover respectively. And they're a nice little thing to scatter around in your map so that you've got something that looks occupied. Let's build a few like that. Okay. Now, besides that, we should really be having a look at walls before we go on to something like vehicles. I mentioned that I'd go back over these, the stone pillars. I wanted to show you that within stone and wood, and metal for that matter, all of the walls areas have pillars with them. So if we find, for example, rough M01, if I place the wall segment itself, this is a dry stone wall that you'll find in a very large number of Company of Heroes maps. And it comes with its own post, rough M gate post 01. And this can be used to close off the spline itself. Now if you are building the spline, normally you just have to place these on the ends of them. Unfortunately, there is a very dominant bug with the World Builder tool that we, the community, have access to. Ours doesn't work the same way as Relics does. If you have Relics version, you are able to use basically an entity state. You can click on object splines and tell the object to end. What it will basically do is make a dry stone wall piece like this, where it has quite sharp edges where it finishes. It would instead smooth them off. You'll notice that, especially with things like these brick walls over here, it will add small little posts to them. And unfortunately, if you go looking for walls like that, like brick S01 and brick S02, don't actually have a post to place. The nearest thing you can get is brick M post, and as I'm sure you'll find, it's a bit too big. So we are very limited with our assets sometimes, and I'm afraid there's no real way around that. If you were to use the stamp tool, which is something that will be covered in the written wiki in a bit more detail, you can actually copy assets that already have these states already on them. But for the purposes of building our own maps, I'm afraid we are quite limited with what we can do. Anyways, let's get rid of those, and let's go and have a look at vehicles. Now, vehicles are an important folder because you'll find civilian vehicles scattered around on plenty of maps. If we go into civilian vehicles, you'll see everything from boats, you'll see basic cars like these, but you'll also find farm trucks, which are quite nice to add around, as well as burnt trucks, which are great. These mostly give off green cover. They're small objects, but the idea is you can place them in key locations so that infantry will usually have to fight over them in the early game and make them quite difficult to displace. However, if you go out of civilian, you'll also find farm vehicles, which are very similar, things like tractors, but you'll find some wooden ones like wagons. In military, however, we have to start being careful. There are a variety of vehicles within this folder that will be able to be salvaged. If you know Company of Heroes 2, you'll know that some units have the ability to salvage vehicles for fuel or munitions. Now, what you'll want to do is try to avoid using those assets there because some of those can be salvaged. The ones that can't be salvaged are in wrecked vehicles and specifically have the prefix map object. So if we get map object Sherman 105 and place it, it is a wrecked vehicle of the Sherman tank, which has already been blown up but cannot be salvaged for anything. This will provide green cover in game. It'll be destroyed pretty fast as well, but it means that certain teams like the OKW, which have salvage on their base units, Stone Pioneers, they can't take advantage of this and they don't have an early game advantage. Still, if you wanted to try and add other wrecked vehicles into your game, you are absolutely free to do so, but be very aware, only those that have map object written on them are safe to be avoiding things like salvage. Anyways, let's have a look for some other little things that we should probably add to our map. Now, we might not necessarily need any more man-made objects for now. We can go around and populate the entire map, and I will do probably between videos, start adding more and more objects like this. But if we go into Art Nature instead, let's go looking for some things that you are very likely to use. We've already used hedgerows here, so we don't have to worry about those too much. But bushes are something that should never be taken lightly. A lot of very popular maps use bushes often because they're an extremely temporary way of issuing yellow cover. You'll notice that some of these bushes have different suffixes to them. Things like summer, snow, and nothing at all in this case. Those that have nothing at all were actually originally released with the game based around the Eastern Front, and therefore are designed for autumn or winter maps. Snow ones, on the other hand, can be exactly the same. They can have similar properties, but usually are suited for a snow map only. Whereas the summer ones came out instead with the Western Front armies, and these are mostly green. Now, our map could easily suit either the brown or the green looking bushes. It really wouldn't matter too much, and some of them blend together quite nicely. The idea with bushes is, though, while you can use splines to place them, I personally find it's better to just move back and forth between the lists, placing them randomly, mixing them together, so that it looks a little bit more realistic. On this fence, for example, I want to try and blend in this fence post that's not there anymore, because I can't actually end a spline. I can place a post manually, but there's no real need. So I'm going to use a large bush, like bush 01 summer, place that right in the middle there, grab bush 02 summer, place it next to it, and then a little bit further down, I'm going to get bush row 1 and mix it with bush row 4 summer. Start placing these together. Now, this is a really simple way of just dressing up your map. If I go out of bushes, I can also find things like scrub. And inside scrub, you'll find things like branch piles, which can add a nice little bit of detail to your maps, as well as some scrub. Scrub just generically makes things look a little bit overgrown. It doesn't really do much in terms of gameplay. You can get smaller versions of them, however. It's just for adding details. And another really useful one to use are trees small, or trees S, and go looking for the generic set. There aren't many of them, unfortunately, but generic 5, 6, and 7 can be used on summer maps. If I show you them together, generic 5 is not bad, it's quite tall. Generic 6 is 2 trees together, so we can put them on either side of the fence post. Generic 7 is very small. We can also use generic 8 in our summer maps, but usually it's better served for certain locations, because generic 8 is a dead tree. It looks great in winter maps, but if you place it in the right areas, like say for example in the midst of hedgerows, it doesn't look too out of place. I can put a few of the generic 06s in there as well, and it makes them look a little bit more overgrown. If I go back to this idea as well and grab some more bushes, I can add larger bushes like these and place them within the hedgerows. Maybe not that one, but let's grab that one. There you go. Although I wouldn't recommend that you layer too many objects on top of each other, maybe 1 or 2 blended together can give a really realistic feel to maps. And even though this fence in particular is quite well covered with bushes, even then you don't need to use that many of them. Space them apart. It is also very common to use bushes instead of fences in some place, bearing in mind that light vehicles could easily drive through that fence and crush it anyway. The fence is only really there for the benefit of infantry, but bushes have much lower value of health than small trees and bushes. So if you want an area that's a little bit better defended than just a bush on its own, but not as well defendable as a dry stone wall, then having this combo is a pretty good idea. We should be able to go through our entire map and start dressing up all of these fences and all these hedgerows so that it looks like a realistic and alive map. But before we wrap this up, what I wanted to do is talk about object placement in terms of territory points. Now, I've left some very specific things open. If, for example, you look at this VP, you'll notice that there are 2 buildings looking straight at it, almost perfectly in the center of the map, and there is a brick wall running alongside them. This means that both teams, if they arrive at the victory point at the same time, will have the same advantage as each other. Now, however, that I've placed this burnt out truck here, if the team on the west hand side tries to approach from here, they don't have any green cover to aid them. So we should try and find some other green cover that they can use. Now this is the best thing about creating a map that isn't mirrored. Even though we're using a very mirrored design, we can basically swap and change objects so that it doesn't look exactly the same. If I go back looking through Art Ambient and objects, I need to try and find something that is going to be green cover. And if you don't know the objects too well, this can take a little bit of experimentation. I know for a fact that a lot of vehicles are going to be green, but I want to try and avoid those if I can. If I go into farm features, I could probably use something like a hay pile. Placing a hay pile there basically mirrors the same, and although their health might be a little bit different, it will easily blend them in. What I can do to reinforce the idea that this would make sense, when it comes to using the splat tool, I will place splats underneath to make it look like hay has been here. But because this is also providing green cover, I can place some other similar things, like small hay bales, next to it, so that it doesn't look out of place. This doesn't really provide any extra cover to this area because there's already a dry stone wall, but it just allows things to blend in quite nicely. Similarly over here, we have these walls that are blocking infantry and units from going towards this point here. On this side, we have hedgerows, but it's quite a lot more open. There's not as many restrictions here. So what I might do instead is go up to defences, and I can go to metal, and place some barbed wire. I can start using objects like this to try and close off small parts of the map. I can even use things like Hedgehog 03, and start placing defences on the wrong side. So infantry that are trying to come from the middle upwards are going to come across this barbed wire and not get any cover from it. And same as if they come up from this side, they'll have this wall but they won't be able to see the flag from it. So they'll have to leave cover in order to try and capture the flag. Again, this idea of mixing and matching what type of objects you use makes maps look a lot more realistic without being perfectly mirrored. It's worth trying some things out and seeing whether or not you can get a flavour for what you want to try. But at the end of the day, experimentation is the key. If you don't know how an object reacts or how it's going to cause your gameplay to change, try it, test it. Whenever you try something new, always jump into game, run a little simulation and see if it works for you. If not, delete it, try something different. Anyways, that was a bit of a speedy one, but there are so many things you can do with the object placement tool, but they are almost entirely down to your imagination. Use images off the internet or read a few books, get some inspiration for what would be in these areas if you're basing it off real life events. And hopefully we'll be able to come back to a map which is fully populated with objects and move on to the finishing steps. I hope to see you in our next step. See you then.